Most elite soldiers at least look intimidating. History's most lethal snipers did not get that memo. One was a Finnish dairy farmer with the face of a man who had never experienced a bad day. One was a Soviet university student who volunteered for a war and spent her first weeks digging trenches without a gun. One was a Canadian indigenous hunter whose own government did not particularly want him until they absolutely needed him. All of them ended up in history books. None of the people they were aiming at ended up anywhere. These are the deadliest snipers the world has ever produced. If you were designing the world's deadliest sniper from scratch, you probably would not start with a Finnish farmer who spent most of his adolescence talking to cows. You would probably go bigger. Broader shoulders, more cinematic backstory, maybe a tragic mentor figure and a training montage scored to something orchestral. Simo Heihe did not have any of that. What he had was a rifle, a very large quantity of personal silence, and an almost supernatural ability to send a bullet through something very small from a very large distance away. The cows were just the warm-up act. Born in 1905 in Rautjärvi, a small municipality in southeastern Finland, Simo grew up the way Finnish farm kids typically grew up in the early 20th century, quietly, practically, and with dirt under their fingernails at all times. His childhood consisted of the standard agricultural workload, tilling soil, tending livestock, harvesting crops, plus an unusually large amount of time spent in the surrounding forests with his father, hunting. This turned out to be the relevant part. Simo was not just capable at hunting. He was the kind of good at it that made other people feel slightly inadequate about their own skill sets. At 17, Simo volunteered to join Finland's Civil Guard, the country's National Reserve Defense Force, and immediately became the guy everyone else on the range looked at sideways. He was reclusive, quiet, and showed absolutely no interest in impressing anyone. And yet every single time he raised a rifle, people stopped what they were doing to watch. He entered marksmanship competitions. He won marksmanship competitions. He won marksmanship competitions by margins that made everyone else in the competition wonder if they had misunderstood the activity. His peers were baffled. His superiors were not. They had a pretty clear idea of what they were looking at. One documented competition feat from this period. Simo hit a small target 6 separate times in under 60 seconds from 150 meters away using a bolt-action rifle with no scope. For context, that is roughly the equivalent of shooting a Happy Meal 6 times in under a minute from 1.5 football fields, away with a rifle you have to manually reload after each shot. The Finnish Civil Guard was genuinely impressed. They were also visibly relieved that Simo was on their side. Something else Simo's hunting background had given him, beyond raw accuracy, was an unusual relationship with patience. Hunting in Finnish forests in winter demands a specific kind of stillness that most people find genuinely unpleasant. You do not move. You do not make noise. You hold a position for however long is required and you wait, often in temperatures that make waiting feel medically inadvisable. Simo had been doing this since childhood. It was not discipline to him, it was just Tuesday. This particular trait, it turned out, was going to be extraordinarily useful. Fast forward to 1939, and Finland's situation stops being peaceful. The Soviet Union, operating under Stalin's leadership and freshly in the business of territorial expansion, decided it wanted a buffer zone along the Finnish border. The method chosen to justify this was a false flag operation. Soviet forces shelled their own territory near the Finnish border, blamed Finland for the attack, and used that as the reason to invade. Want to start a war but not be viewed as the aggressor? Simply attack yourself and blame someone else. Problem solved until it very much was not. The Winter War had begun, and Simo Heiha, living quietly on his farm, put on a white snowsuit and reported for duty. On the other side of Europe, roughly 2 decades earlier, a girl named Lyudmila Pavlichenko was born in 1916 into what was still technically the Russian Empire, in the region that would become Ukraine. The world she was born into offered her exactly as many opportunities as it felt like on any given day, which fluctuated considerably. Lyudmila, Luda to anyone who spent more than 10 minutes around her, grew up sharp, driven, and constitutionally incapable of accepting that a thing could not be done. These are excellent qualities for a historian. As it would turn out, they are even better qualities for a sniper. As a teenager, Luda found competitive marksmanship largely by accident, joining a local shooting club and discovering almost immediately that she was significantly better at it than the people who had been there longer. She placed well in youth marksmanship competitions. She kept practicing. Shooting paper targets in a local club is not a career, though, so she went to work at a munitions factory in Kyiv to pay the bills and simultaneously enrolled at university, pursuing a degree in history. In the gaps between factory shifts and lectures, she attended sniper training classes run by the Red Army. Normal Tuesday stuff. By June 1941, Luda was 24 years old, partway through her university degree, and running what appeared to be a perfectly serviceable version of her life. Then Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and the perfectly serviceable version was immediately canceled. Chitapaks, Operation Barbarossa opened the Eastern Front, and the Soviet military needed soldiers fast. Trained soldiers especially. Luda formally volunteered within days of the invasion. Given her documented marksmanship background, she was assigned to the Red Army's 25th Rifle Division, becoming one of approximately 2,000 female snipers that the Soviet Union had pragmatically decided were worth deploying. The Red Army was correct about this. It would take a few weeks of trench labor and rifle shortages for everyone else to catch up, but the conclusion was never really in doubt. Two people then, different countries, different decades, different circumstances, and different wars that had arrived at their doors via completely different political disasters on opposite ends of the European continent. One had spent the better part of his life learning the precise geometry of stillness in a Finnish forest, developing a patience that most people cannot physically sustain. The other had spent hers moving between factory floors, lecture halls, and shooting ranges, accumulating a skill set that looked, from the outside, like a very unusual hobby. Neither of them had gone looking for what was coming. The war had simply done the math and shown up, and for anyone in the wrong uniform within range of either of them, that was going to be a significant problem. Simo Häyhä's approach to war was simple in concept and absolutely diabolical in execution. He arrived before dawn, located his position, and did not leave until the surrounding area had become considerably less populated than he found it. His preparation ritual was methodical, almost to the point of being meditative. He packed down the snow directly in front of his rifle's muzzle to prevent any telltale powder kick-up when he fired, then poured water over the packed snow to freeze it into a solid platform. The frozen crust in front of his barrel had the structural integrity of concrete, which is exactly what you want when your survival depends entirely on not announcing your position with a small white explosion every single time you pull a trigger. He also ate snow while waiting, not for any reason beyond the thoroughly practical, though given everything we know about Simo, it is not impossible that he found it genuinely pleasant, but specifically to suppress the visible breath clouds that extreme cold produces around a warm human face. In winter warfare, a puff of warm breath hanging in the frozen air above a snowbank is roughly the sniper's equivalent of a neon sign, reading "Please, look here immediately." Simo eliminated this problem the way he eliminated most problems in his life. Quietly, practically, and with no discernible interest in whether anyone found it impressive. He also refused to use a telescopic scope. Not as a flex, though it absolutely reads like one in retrospect. He was not extensively trained in their use, and had learned early to trust what he already knew. There was also the practical reality that a scope requires raising your head fractionally higher than iron sights do, exposing marginally more skull to people who were actively looking for a reason to shoot it. Scopes fog up an extreme cold. They also occasionally catch direct sunlight and reflect it outward like a small enthusiastic mirror with very strong opinions about broadcasting your exact location to everyone within a kilometer. Iron sights, packed snow, borrowed patience from a childhood spent in frozen forests, waiting for prey that didn't always show up. That was the entire operational system. Over 98 days of the Winter War, Simo accumulated 542 confirmed kills. That number deserves to be read twice. 542. Confirmed means independently verified. Another person present who witnessed the event and could testify that yes, that soldier is dead. I was watching when it happened. Soviet command dedicated serious resources to ending this situation. Counter-sniper teams, specifically assembled and deployed to find a single Finnish farmer in a white snowsuit who had so far proven impossible to locate and catastrophically lethal once he located you. Artillery strikes directed at his last known position based on imprecise intelligence and rapidly evaporating hope. Coordinated search operations of a scale typically reserved for neutralizing entire enemy units, directed at one individual who kept moving before anyone could triangulate him. The Soviets called him the White Death, which is the kind of designation assigned when your descriptive options have run out entirely and your morale was already struggling before this particular problem showed up. The Finnish side found the name genuinely motivating. The Soviet side found it something considerably less so. Roughly 1,000 miles south and approximately 2 years later in time, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was mounting a highly effective argument against the administrative decision that had assigned her to trench digging. Her first confirmed kills came via a Mosin Nagant rifle borrowed from a wounded comrade because the Red Army had not yet managed to issue her one, and they consisted of 2 German officers eliminated from just over 1,300 feet away. 2 officers. Borrowed rifle. First time out in the field. She was not warmed up yet. Over the months that followed, Luda fought through the siege of Odessa, where Soviet and Romanian forces engaged in exactly the sort of grinding, attrition-based urban combat that produces either complete psychological collapse or a soldier of exceptional focus and adaptability. Luda produced the latter reliably and consistently. She was promoted. She trained other snipers, passing on technique with the specific authority of someone who had actually done the thing being taught rather than simply studied it at a distance. She was promoted again. She fell in love with a fellow officer during the siege, which is objectively the worst possible timing, and lost him to a mortar shell a short time later, which is the war being its most deliberately and specifically cruel. She continued fighting. By 1942, when mortar shrapnel finally forced her evacuation from the front lines, Lyudmila Pavlichenko had 309 confirmed kills recorded under her name. That total included 36 enemy snipers, worth flagging as its own category because enemy snipers are, by the nature of their profession, exactly the people most actively trying to find and eliminate you before you find and eliminate them. She found them first, all 36 times. The Soviet Union awarded her the title Lady Death, which, alongside White Death, makes this one of the only periods in documented military history where the 2 most dangerous people on opposite sides of 2 different conflicts had symmetrically terrifying nicknames at the same time. The Soviets sent dedicated counter-sniper units after Simo specifically, which is a remarkable commitment of resources for one man in a snowsuit. The Germans placed a formal bounty on his head. Multiple attempts were made to shell the approximate area where he had last been reported, which is the tactical equivalent of mailing a strongly worded letter, emotionally reasonable, practically useless. Meanwhile, Luda had become prominent enough that her 1942 propaganda tour of North America included a formal reception by Franklin Roosevelt, making her the first Soviet citizen received by a sitting American president. The American press marked this occasion by asking whether she found it unfeminine to kill people and requesting opinions on her military uniform. Luda found this journalism deeply unimpressive. She said so. The tour continued regardless. Both of them had now reached the altitude of being famous enough that stopping them had become a strategic priority for the opposing side. Neither had been stopped. That was about to change, and the mechanism in both cases was the same. Not a counter-sniper, not an artillery strike, not a search operation, just the war finally close enough to reach them directly. On March 6, 1940, Simo Häyhä was shot in the face. The round was an explosive bullet, a type formally banned from warfare by international convention since 1868, banned, somewhat pointedly, by Russia specifically. The bullet entered through his lower left jaw and took a significant portion of it on the way through, rendering him immediately unconscious and, for a brief period of time, presumed dead by the soldiers who found him. He was not dead. He was, however, going to need several surgeries and a reconstructive process that lasted weeks, during which time the Winter War continued without him, and the Soviets quietly noted that the kill rate in the relevant sector had dropped to something approaching manageable. Simo regained consciousness on March 13, 1940. That date is notable for a reason entirely beyond his control. It was the same day the Winter War officially ended. He had been unconscious for exactly the duration required to miss the conclusion of the conflict he had spent 98 days defining. His face required extensive reconstruction. His jaw had to be partially rebuilt. Surgeons did what they could, and what they could do turned out to be more than sufficient. Simo recovered, his face settling into something that looked, by most accounts, not dramatically unlike the face he had started with. The smile, specifically, survived intact, which, given the entry point of the bullet, is either a medical miracle or evidence that Simo Häyhä was simply too contented a person for conventional physics to fully inconvenience. The peace agreement that ended the Winter War gave the Soviet Union the territorial concessions it had started the war to obtain. This included the Karelian Isthmus, which contained Simo's farm. The land he had grown up on, hunted on, and returned from the front to recover on was now Soviet territory. The Finnish government, to their credit, responded to this by promptly granting him replacement land and a military promotion. Simo accepted both, thanked everyone involved at whatever his characteristic level of enthusiasm was, and resumed farming. He did not give many interviews. He did not seek public attention. When asked later in his long life about his feelings regarding the kill count history had assigned him, he offered a response that has circulated ever since. He did what he was asked to do, as well as he could do it, and that seemed like enough. He died in 2002 at the age of 96, which is both a very long life and an extremely satisfying final detail, given that the Soviet Union he spent 98 days terrifying had collapsed 11 years before he did. Lyudmila Pavlichenko's exit from combat was messier and less conclusive in the short term. The mortar shrapnel that hit her in 1942 was serious enough to require evacuation and hospitalization, but not, ultimately, fatal. The war had been trying to kill her for over a year by that point, with considerably more focused effort than a stray fragment, and had not managed it. She spent approximately a month recovering before receiving orders that redirected her away from the front entirely. She was given a new role, public representative of Soviet military capability, sent to tour Allied nations and make the case that the Eastern Front deserved more aggressive support from the Western powers. She was very good at this. She was considerably less good at tolerating journalists who wanted to discuss her appearance instead of her confirmed kill count of 309, which, to be clear, included 36 enemy snipers and constituted one of the most statistically remarkable individual combat records of the entire war. The American press remained committed to its priorities. Luda remained committed to her contempt for them. Neither side converted the other. She returned to the Soviet Union after the tour without returning to battle, spending the remaining war years training the next generation of Red Army snipers. After the war, she completed the history degree she had set aside for the invasion, graduating from Kyiv University and working as a research assistant for the Soviet Navy for the remainder of her professional life. She wrote. She gave lectures. She received the Hero of the Soviet Union designation, the highest military honor the Soviet state could confer, and she carried that distinction alongside the Lady Death designation with the specific equanimity of a person who had never particularly needed external validation to know what she had done. She died in 1974 at the age of 58, young by any measure, and she remains to this day the most lethal female combatant in recorded military history. That record has stood for over 50 years and shows no sign of changing, because producing someone with 309 confirmed kills turns out to require a fairly precise combination of talent, circumstance, and a war large enough to contain it. What Simo and Luda shared, beyond kill counts and wartime nicknames that the enemy meant as warnings and history has since reclaimed as accolades, was a fundamental ordinariness that preceded everything. The farmer, the student. Neither had trained for war as a vocation. Both had developed, almost incidentally, a skill so refined that it became extraordinary under pressure. They were not recruited from some elite pool of exceptional candidates. They were found by circumstances and discovered to be exactly what the moment required, which is both the most inspiring version of this story and the most quietly sobering one. The wars that made them legendary also cost them things: a jaw, a husband, farmland, youth, the ability to walk away unaltered from any of it. The records remain. The names remain. The rest is history, in the most literal sense available.